Hey, Liberty and Law students. Good to see you. Although I really can't see you. You can see me. Don't know if that's good or bad. I miss seeing you guys. I enjoy the class conversations and everything. I don't get to ramble as much when I do things online. I'm going to try something different here. Try to simulate a little bit of what we would normally do in class with this reading. From lesson 2 of We the People, I'm going to read the subsection, What Forms of Government Could the Founders Choose From? Only have 15 minutes on the recording, so I won't stop and ramble a whole lot. I may make a few comments at the end if I have a time, but I thought this might be just a little different way to tackle the reading instead of just having to read it on your own. Some people may prefer to read it on your own, but it's always good to have things read to you. Brain research tells us that. So here we go. What forms of government could the founders choose from? And hopefully I won't be interrupted by my two boys during this process. The founders were familiar with the writings of the Greek philosopher Aristotle. Pardon me, I'm reading off the screen over here. The glare is going to be really bad. I'll start over. The founders were familiar with the writings of the Greek philosopher Aristotle, who observed that every state, meaning country or national entity in this sense, must perform three functions. And quick note, a lot of times we think of states like individual states within the U.S., but a lot of times, in a bigger sense, when we refer to a state, it's a self-governing body. Generally, outside the United States, that refers to a nation. First, states must deliberate about what is to be done and decide what public policy should be. Today, we call this the legislative function. Deliberating on and enacting law means making laws. Second, states must perform an executive function through which public officials carry out public policy. That's what the president does. He's the chief executive. And third, states must carry out a judicial function through which disputes about the interpretation of law are managed and applied in everyday life. And in our federal government, national government, that's the federal court system, which at the top of that's the Supreme Court. Aristotle also distinguished between types of governments on the basis of the number of persons exercising power. Countries may be governed by one person, a few people, or many people. Each of these forms of government has a right form and a corrupt form. Right forms are governed for the common good, whereas corrupt forms are governed for the private interest of the rulers. We'll learn more about common good soon. The right form of government by a single person is called a monarchy. The right form of government by a few people is called aristocracy, or the rule of the best. And the right form of government by many is called a polity. Aristotle referred to polity as a mixed form of government or a mixed constitution because it incorporates elements of democracy and oligarchy. See the next paragraph. No group of citizens, for example, the rich or the poor, is able to abuse political power. Although a polity is a mixture of social elements, it is most like democracy as we define the concept today. Comment on that if I have time at the end. According to Aristotle, corrupt form of government are tyranny for rule of a single person, oligarchy for rule of a few, usually rich people, and democracy for rule of the many, by which he meant the poor. The following table illustrates right and corrupt forms of government as identified by Aristotle. And if I was more on top of it, I would pop up the screen and show you that table. But the left column says rule of one, the right form is monarchy, corrupt form is tyranny. Rule of few, right form is aristocracy, corrupt form is oligarchy. Rule of many, right form is polity, a mixed constitution, and the corrupt form is democracy. And that may seem surprising to you, and again, if I have time, I'll comment on that at the end. To Aristotle, democracy meant direct democracy in which the people themselves make decisions rather than the type of government we call democracy today, which is largely representative. Aristotle's description of democracy as a corrupt form of government refers to what ancient Greece experienced when the poor, the many, took power. They attempted to seize the property of the rich for themselves, setting off destructive civil wars based on social class. In such cases, the poor looked after only their own interests to the exclusion of the common good. Although Aristotle classified the governments of countries on the basis of the number of rulers, he also focused on economic considerations within countries, which usually are far more important. He was especially concerned with the distribution of wealth and the effects that various distributions have on political stability, specifically on the avoidance of civil strife, conflict among the people. He concluded that the dominant group of most stable countries consists of those who are neither rich nor poor, but occupy a middle ground of moderate wealth. According to Aristotle, this middle group is known for moderation. Rule by those who are moderate yields the most stable form of government because those of moderate means are likely to behave in accordance with reason. In Aristotle's view, the problem with democracy is that the poor, who are numerous, attempt to seize the wealth of the rich, who are few. But if a constitution can mix the many poor with the lesser number of wealthy persons, then it can achieve stability. The founders were familiar with this idea of a mixed constitution from reading Aristotle and other writers, such as Greek historian Polybius. Polybius popularized the idea in the ancient world that mixed constitution is a combination of monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements. This idea, embraced and passed on by the Roman statesman Cicero, then became widespread among scholars in the Middle Ages, roughly the 5th century to the 14th century, depending on the country. Through Cicero's great influence in the subsequent period of the Renaissance, the 15th to the 17th centuries, the idea of a mixed constitution was incorporated into Renaissance political thought and thus into republicanism. It was then passed on to the Enlightenment in the 18th century, the 1700s. For example, the French political thinker Charles-Louis de Segondant, Baron de la Brede et de Montesquieu, which is how he's typically known as just Montesquieu, cited England as a mixed constitution. The British government had a limited monarch, an aristocracy in one House of Parliament, the House of Lords, which is where the upper class were, and in theory, the House of Commons for the common people. Both of those are houses of Parliament still today in Britain. That's their legislative body. In fact, the landed aristocracy dominated the House of Commons, though they were of lower rank than the members of the House of Lords. Both the British Parliament and the legislators of colonies were examples of representative government. Representative government sometimes is called republican government. The term republic comes from the Roman term res publica, which is Latin for thing or property of the people. The Roman Republic had an unwritten mixed constitution. Its form of government after 287 BC consisted of executive and legislative branches in which virtually all classes and tribes in Roman society were represented. Based on the founders' reading of history and their personal experiences, they did not believe that direct democracy was the best model for government. It could potentially fail to protect property and other rights, such as rights of minorities. The founders preferred a representative or republican form of government, in which many interests can be represented in the legislature, and those who govern, like ordinary citizens, are required to obey the law. So that's the end of the reading. A couple thoughts. One of the things that might surprise you is that Aristotle calls democracy a corrupt or wrong form of government. And that might be surprising because typically we refer to our form of government as a democracy. Well, that's what we call it. What we really have is a mixed constitution, as Aristotle talked about. What we really have, as is mentioned at the end of this, is a republic. We have a representative democracy, not a direct democracy, which is what Aristotle was talking about when he talked about direct democracy being corrupt. As it says, he feared that people could come along, play on the emotions of the masses, and in that time they were particularly not well educated, so they could be easily manipulated, and that people could play on those emotions, turn them against those who had property and wealth, and they would take that property and wealth and upturn society. And those who typically in that time period had property and wealth were the better educated. So he felt like this was a very dangerous thing. Again, that seems contrary to us because we have a democracy. But again, we have a representative democracy. Our founding fathers modeled it after the Roman Republic. The people get to elect people to represent them. The idea is that people will elect those who are smart enough and intelligent enough to make good decisions for them and also exercise the practice of listening to the people and hearing what they want. And as best they can, and as they feel is in the best interest of the people, trying to address those needs. So what we have today is a representative democracy or a republic or a constitutional democracy. Those terms often used interchangeably, slightly different. So that's an important concept to understand. You have a discussion board coming up where you're going to learn that we still have elements of direct democracy in our society today, especially at local and state levels through what's called initiative and referendum. It's a process where citizens can, if there are laws that they want put on the books, go about getting a petition, getting a petition signatures, getting that law put on the book. Or if there's a law on the books they do not like, they can use referendum, get a petition up, get enough signatures, you can vote that off of the ballot. That is a form of direct democracy. It's much easier to do at local and state levels because there are fewer people involved. As you'll read about in some more recent articles, there's differing theories about that. So, interesting reading. I hope this helped some of you. If you have any questions, let me know. I think I've touched on the general things that I usually touch on as we read through and discuss this. Hopefully I helped sort out some of the language there as well. May try to do this again along the way just to help out because I know some of you like to hear people read. I like to hear people read. And as I said, brain research shows it's an effective way to learn and it's a good way to build your reading skills. That's why we read to our kids. All right, there it is. What forms of government could the founders choose from? Hope everybody has a good day, and I will be talking to you later.